3 mechanics had already failed to fix Duke Alvarez's motorcycle, and Bertie Chen had been watching all 3 of them fail from her usual spot on an overturned bucket by the garage door, signing a question to her father that made him set down his wrench entirely. "Can I look?" She signed. "I see something." Bertie was 9 years old, had been deaf since a fever took her hearing before her 2nd birthday, and had spent every Saturday for the past year parked on that same bucket, watching her father and the other mechanics at Sable Rock Cycle Work, communicating in the careful mix of sign language, and pointing that the whole shop had picked up without anyone officially deciding to learn it. Her father, Wei Chen, looked at his daughter, then at Duke's bike, which had stalled intermittently for 6 weeks, despite 3 professional diagnostics finding nothing conclusively wrong. "What do you see?" He signed back. Bertie walked to the bike, put both hands flat against the engine casing the way she always did, feeling for the vibration she couldn't hear, and pointed to a spot near the ignition coil that none of the 3 mechanics had flagged as worth a second look. "That wire moves when it shouldn't," she signed. "I watched it happen twice. What happened over the following week would end with 180 motorcycles filling the road outside Sable Rock Cycle in Sable Rock, Colorado, and 3 grown mechanics learning that the diagnostic tool they'd been missing the whole time couldn't be bought from any supplier, because it lived inside a 9-year-old girl who had only learned to watch more closely than anyone who could still hear ever needed to. Sable Rock sat in the high desert foothills of southern Colorado, a town of ranch families and a 2-lane highway that carried more motorcycles through in summer than the rest of the year combined. And Sable Rock Cycle had operated out of the same converted barn for 15 years, run by Wei Chen and staffed by 2 other mechanics, who'd known Bertie since she was old enough to toddle around the shop floor in oversized safety glasses. Duke Alvarez was 51 years old, president of the local Iron Vow chapter, and had been riding the same 1979 Shovelhead for over 2 decades, a bike that carried enough sentimental weight. It had been his late wife's wedding gift to him, that trading it in had never once been a real option, no matter how frustrating the recent stalling had become. Wei had checked the ignition system twice, the carburetor once, and had brought in 2 outside specialists over 6 weeks, each of them running full diagnostics that came back clean every single time, because the problem only ever showed itself for a few seconds at irregular intervals that no scheduled test run had managed to catch. Before we get any further, if this is your first time here, hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Because the week that followed wasn't only about a stubborn engine, it was about an entire garage full of experienced mechanics discovering that a 9-year-old who'd never once heard an engine running had been quietly out diagnosing all of them simply by paying closer attention than sound ever demanded from anyone else. Now, back 7 years, to the fever that took Bertie's hearing before she'd learned to speak more than a handful of words. Bertie Chen had lost her hearing to a severe viral infection just before her 2nd birthday, fast enough that her parents barely had time to prepare before the world went silent for their daughter permanently. Wei and his wife, Marisol, had thrown themselves into learning American Sign Language within months, determined that Bertie would never once feel like her silence was a wall between herself and the people who loved her. Bertie had grown into an unusually observant child, the kind of watchful curiosity that people often develop when one sense goes quiet and the others learn to work considerably harder to compensate. She'd started coming to the shop with her father on Saturdays 4 years ago, at first just to be near him, and had slowly become genuinely fascinated by the engines themselves, the way parts fit together, the specific vibrations different problems produced, patterns she could feel with her palms flat against a casing that told her things the mechanics were mostly listening for instead. She couldn't hear a misfire, but she could watch a spark plug's timing, could feel an irregular vibration through her hands, with a precision that came from 4 years of paying the kind of undistracted visual attention that hearing mechanics, trained to listen first, sometimes rushed past without meaning to. Duke's bike had become the shop's most stubborn puzzle in years, stalling for 2 or 3 seconds at seemingly random moments, always recovering before anyone could pinpoint exactly what had happened. Wei had started keeping a log of every incident, trying to find a pattern in engine temperature, speed, or duration, and had come up empty every time. Birdie had been watching the bike run on the shop's stationary test stand twice now, both times catching something the mechanics, focused on listening for irregular engine notes, hadn't been watching closely enough to notice. A specific wire near the ignition coil that flexed slightly at a certain engine speed, just enough to create a fraction of a second gap in the connection before settling back into place. You want to let a 9-year-old take a look at professional-grade diagnostics? One of the shop's other mechanics, Gary, asked, not unkindly, more surprised than doubtful. She's caught things before, Wei said. 6 words, and something in his tone made Gary reconsider his own skepticism. Birdie ran the bike again herself, hands flat against the casing, eyes fixed entirely on the wiring harness near the coil, rather than divided across the whole engine bay the way an experienced mechanic's attention naturally spread. She caught the flex on the second attempt, exactly where she'd expected it, and pointed with the specific confidence of someone who had already ruled out every other possibility through 4 years of careful, patient watching. There, she signed. Right there. Every time. Wei examined the connection point Birdie indicated and found a wire routed at an angle that let it brush, almost imperceptibly, against a bracket edge whenever the engine reached a particular vibration frequency, wearing through insulation slowly enough that no visual inspection at rest had ever caught it, and intermittent enough that no diagnostic scan running under different conditions had ever triggered a fault code. She's right, Wei said, quiet, staring at a problem that had eluded 2 outside specialists and cost Duke considerably more in diagnostic fees than the actual fix would ultimately require. It's been rubbing against this bracket the whole time. Duke, standing at the edge of the garage, watched Wei reroute the wire and secure it properly, and felt something considerably larger than relief settle into his chest once the bike started and idled clean through a 15-minute test run, without a single stall. 6 weeks, Duke said, and my mechanic's 9-year-old daughter found it in 20 minutes. Birdie, watching his face rather than needing to hear the words, understood exactly what his expression meant even before her father finished translating. She says she's just been watching, Wei sighed, then said aloud for Duke's benefit. That's all. She just watches more carefully than the rest of us remember to. Word of what Birdie had done moved through the iron valve fast. The particular story that needed no exaggeration to land with its full weight, a deaf child had solved, through patient, undistracted observation. A problem that had stumped 3 trained professionals, relying on the one sense she'd never had access to at all. Duke told the story at the next chapter meeting, and by the end of the week, riders from 4 neighboring chapters were driving to Sable Rock Cycle specifically to meet the 9-year-old who'd outdiagnosed all of them. Engines, first, and then chrome filling the road outside Sable Rock Cycle as the mountain light spread gold over the foothills. 180 motorcycles rolling in from every direction within reach. Riders who'd heard one story about a deaf girl's careful eyes catching what nobody's ears had managed to. Engines dying in sequence until the road held nothing but the tick of 180 cooling engines, and a silence Birdie couldn't hear, but felt anyway, through the ground beneath her feet, vibrating with a stillness considerably larger than anything she'd felt before. Not one rider came only out of curiosity. They came because a story like Birdie's, once heard, made an entire community want to make sure a 9-year-old with that kind of gift never had to wonder whether anyone valued it. Duke found Bertie by the garage door, overwhelmed by a crowd she couldn't hear, but could clearly see filling every inch of the road outside. He crouched to her level and signed, carefully, in the handful of phrases he'd asked Way to teach him the night before. "You are amazing," he signed, slow and deliberate. Bertie smiled and signed back through her father, "I only watch. That's all I do." "That's not all you do," Duke said, watching Way translate. "That's the rarest skill in this whole garage, and you've had it since, before most of us thought to notice." A regional trade school representative, present among the gathered riders through a connection one member had made, offered Bertie a standing invitation to their youth mechanics program the moment she was old enough, tuition covered in full by a fund the chapter established on the spot. Gary, humbled rather than embarrassed by being out-diagnosed by a 9-year-old, started teaching Bertie basic terminology in sign language himself, determined that she'd have a full vocabulary for the trade by the time most kids her age were still deciding what they wanted to be. Duke's shovelhead ran perfectly at that year's memorial ride for his late wife, and he made a point, every year after, of having Bertie do the final check on it personally before he rode. She still comes to Sable Rock Cycle every Saturday, still parks herself on the same overturned bucket, watching engines the rest of the shop is still learning to watch as closely as she always has. If this story reached you, if you believe that paying closer attention is sometimes worth more than any tool money can buy, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs reminding that the people who watch the most carefully are often the ones the rest of us underestimate first. Subscribe to Iron Vow Stories so you never miss the next one. And tell me in the comments, what have you noticed that nobody else around you ever seemed to catch?